And it'll be a really interesting session for me as well, because we have three of the most, I think, really productive faculty in our department. And so I think, this is meant to be kind of an informal discussion if you have questions, but it's also about, tips and tricks in terms of getting things done, and also navigating through our grad program. So I thought we could just kind of, I don't know if people prepared something, but if you had, we could just kind of go through, and then people could also chime in with questions or thoughts and so on. How does that sound? So maybe we could just start this way. Should we just?
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say a few things.
Yeah, I didn't prepare anything, but I have some things to say.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Well, my mantra, the same thing that I always talk about is, you got to fill up your head with all kinds of stuff to begin with. So before you write, you should have something, to draw on. And so it's not like, you have this blank slate and say, oh, I've got to write something about, let's say, the relationship between culture and political economy. Now I wonder, who's written about that? You have to have stuff, that you can draw from. And just to give you an idea, some years ago, I was doing a course on the cultural component of political economy, and at the same time trying to write an essay on it. And when I just kept thinking of it as an abstract problem, it's this one concept and another, I figured out I needed a vehicle of some sort to analyze in order to do it. Well, it just so happens among the films I watched was Babette's Feast, which was about a really complex set of cultural exchanges. The austere, small Protestant sect run by two sisters has a visitor at one point, a refugee from the Paris Commune, who they take into their house, and she ends up being their cook, and they teach her how to make this really austere meal, the same fish dish every day, which is horribly boring. But anyway, Babette at one point decides that because she's been rescued by the sisters, she has to reciprocate. And she was once a chef at a very fancy Paris restaurant, so she creates this order, and all this wonderful stuff comes in. But this obscure Protestant sect feels that they shouldn't enjoy themselves, and so they decide that they're going to be silent during the feast and never say anything about it, and thereby kill it, which is interesting because to silence and to kill comes from the same root. But anyway, once I started looking at that, then everything fell into place again. I was able to think of the cultural component, the value of the things involved, and so forth and so on. And if it didn't have that in my head, if I hadn't been, playing with lots of different cultural texts, I wouldn't have anything to use. So there's that. The other important thing, my experience is, when you're writing, wherever you stop, don't just stop with a period. Put it in a parentheses and say, next, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and you do at least 2 paragraphs worth, so that you come back to your piece of work and you know what's next. Because the main thing about working is knowing what's coming up when you get up in the morning. Not saying, gee, I'd like to do some work today. Where to start? And then other forms of organization. Having 1 or 2 files where you collected materials for the project, which you keep filling up. And I do it both electronically and with paper, so I have a big kind of file in which I keep dumping stuff. And then when it comes to writing, I start working on an outline of all the stuff I've collected. But then as I write, I begin to realize that the outline wasn't working exactly right, so at the bottom of the file that I'm writing on, I re-outline constantly below, so I can then go back down to it and bring the stuff up and so forth. And then brings electronic stuff in from the other file, the stuff you've collected, and keep dumping it into this one, so you can reorganize it. And management's a big problem, a big part of writing, I think. Unless you work out a management structure, it gets hard to do it. And then just sitting there with some blank thing in front of it. I'll probably have some other things to say, but at least start with that.
Do you write every day, or like?
Yeah, I have a routine. I get up in the morning, have my coffee and stuff, and then I work writing usually for the first 2 hours. And I use the afternoon to look at the outline, look at what other material I need, go to the library, download stuff, fill stuff up so the next day I have new stuff.
Could you write with people a lot of times. How do you manage when you write?
Writing with somebody? I don't really have any clear model of that. What I usually do is we have a negotiation about who's going to do what kind of part. And then we share drafts back and forth and start filling in. But I guess the most important thing about writing someone is choosing someone who you can write with. That's the thing. There's got to be some compatibility there.
Yeah, like Mitt Romney, I have a 5-point plan. I just hope it's going to be more substantive than Romney's. Basically, what I was trying to do is I was trying to kind of talk a little bit about what I'm doing, a little bit like what Mike was saying, but actually relate that to the graduate student experience and try to remember some of the things that I did. So, point one really is I think productive habits start very early, and the earlier you start, the easier it is, I think, to cultivate them and to really make them a habit. It's kind of very Aristotelian when Aristotle talks about making things into habit or turning things into habit, and I think that kind of pattern, setting the pattern, really should start as early as possible. First point really has to do with the courses that you're taking and the courses that I took, the seminars that I took that I remember. My goal was always to write in that seminar, in that course, the research paper, because most of the time there were research papers that were required, to write them with the intention of turning them either into an article or part of a dissertation, my dissertation obviously. So that means it's a kind of a coordination and a negotiation. I usually would talk to the instructor to see whether it would be okay sometimes to adapt a little bit the paper, if I had something specific in mind, a specific journal in mind, or if it was part of my dissertation, a little bit what you and I did, Rex, just recently, talk to the instructor about what I think my dissertation will be, or if you already know what the dissertation is, and then see if there's some sort of leeway to accommodate that. So this can become part of my productive work that's a little bit larger. So that's the first point. Write for publication, write for your dissertation. Use every single seminar course for that. The second one, and this is kind of related, is to take advantage of faculty accessibility. And I think we're really all spoiled here, and I only noticed that when I started working in Australia, where faculty accessibility is at most 10% of what it is here. And I think this department particularly is very, very generous. There are a number of people, I mean, Debbie is unbeatable in terms of her open door policy, but Mike, hangs out very often, Hito hangs out very often, I'm there quite a bit. And I think it really, really makes sense to overcome what I think is a very natural sense of, well, I don't really want to bother them. And you don't have to just drop in on us, but I think to just send an email and make it a habit to talk to a number of faculty, even if you're already advanced and the faculty is not necessarily on the dissertation committee. There might be something that the faculty really can tell you, in a personal conversation, particularly if you come with some question in mind. And I think it's just really a great, great resource. I learned so much talking to faculty, and I think that type of feedback, that kind of accessibility, is an asset that is definitely something well worth taking. The third one is, as you know, there was this inscription on the Temple of Delphi, "Know thyself." I'd like to change that to "Know your top 5 journals." In other words, what are the top 5 journals in your area? And what types of papers do they accept? What kind of special issues do they have? What kinds of themes do they seem to favor? who are the people who get published in there? And I think if you have that kind of basic overview, and also what is their kind of position in the field? Are there, very, very specialized journals? That's fine. Are they more transdisciplinary? That's fine. But just know the 5 journals that kind of correspond the most to the type of work, the type of research questions that you have. And know also who's on the editorial board. And I'll get to that a little bit later. Kind of get already a mental picture of who are the people who are connected to these journals and what do they do. And very often that leads you to books and other articles that I think are very, very useful, which goes back to what Mike said just at the beginning, in terms of know who the people are, who are writing in your field, or what I would say, who address the type of research questions that you are interested in. Fourth, conferences. Go to conferences, not just to present the paper, which is very important, but go to conferences in order to network. Network, network, network. One of the things that my advisor did, my PhD advisor did, and at the beginning I think I wasn't quite kicking and screaming, but I was very reluctant because it was very embarrassing, is he would drag me from one booth to the next at APSA with the publishers and would introduce me to editors. And I was mortified. I didn't have much to say, I thought, and yet being able to just exchange a few words, to get to know you, you talk, again, you get the lay of the land with regard to the publishing universe. You get to know a couple of people. Very often you can follow up, which I think is very important. And don't be shy. If there are faculty that go to APSA, that go to ISA, that go to the kinds of conferences that you're interested in, ask them. Ask us. And say, would it be okay for an hour or for 2 hours, to maybe you can introduce me to some people, whether it's publishers, whether it's, colleagues. And believe it or not, most of us actually, don't have any objections to that.
I have an anecdote that's relevant to that. Jeff
Mhm.
Whitehall went up to the Cornell guy at one of the conferences and said, I'd like to have a conversation with you, but I have no idea how to talk to publishers. Can you help me? And this guy sat down with Jeff, and they had about a half an hour conversation, and the guy explained to him, the kind of thing that we sort of look for, so some of them are totally obtuse and very status oriented, and some of them are helpful.
Absolutely. So, and again, you see, this is your initiative. This is again a faculty resource that I think is here that could be used for that. And then finally, my 5th point. It also goes back to something that Mike said when he said that he's writing every day in the morning for a couple of hours. I think, and you may disagree, but in my experience, there are really 2 types, maybe even 3 or 4 types, mixed type, but 2 basic types of scholars who, type A would be Mike. These are people who write every day, very often in the morning. I know a lot of people who exactly like Mike, to get up in the morning. Some people get actually up very early because they feel they can really write very well early in the morning. Some people are writing in the evening, but they write every day for 2 or 3 hours, and they manage to keep that discipline going pretty much because it's become part of a habit. Type B is me actually, and that is people who cannot write every day because I simply can't just write for 2 hours and then do what Mike said and say next, because I just need a bigger block of time in order to really get my thoughts organized and get a bigger chunk done. And the way I do it typically is that for me, one day of the week, happens to be Sunday most of the time, is my writing day. This is why I get up early. Weekend. You want a weekend? Yes. Friday night, Saturday, take off. But Sunday, if you're that type, would be a really, really good day because I typically get about 8 to 10 hours on Saturdays and get a lot of writing done that day. And then I can go back during the week and I can do other things that need to be done. But every week I get a significant chunk of writing done. Obviously, you can use the week to talk to, to get email stuff done that relates to your work and minor things. But generally speaking, I think the type B is a person who just needs a longer block of time. Very often, I also take out, spring recess or something like that, a whole week, and it's almost like a retreat. I plan that. I kind of clearly lay out, which days am I going to be able to write, and I want this long period of time to be able to get a lot of work done.
A lot of it has to do with your bodily metabolism.
Yeah, I think so.
I have a short attention span, so I'm actually typing, when I write, I'm standing up most of the time. I've set up a pedestal because I type a sentence or two, and or a paragraph, and I walk around and have fantasies. And think about something else, and I walk back to it again and see if I can focus once again.
Right. So that's basically it. A footnote would be, it's wonderful to have cohorts of people who take courses, which you can in the UK and Australia. You don't have that, and to just take advantage and form little groups and I think you're already doing that, of people who help each other out, or reading groups around research questions and issues. I think it's just a fantastic thing to do as well. So that's pretty much what I have.
Mine isn't going to be all that different. It started as 5 points and it's kind of grown a little bit. When I worked at Otterbein, which is where I worked before here, they did a lot of faculty development, and one day, or one of the faculty development talks was about getting writing done. And of course, there the teaching load was 7 courses a year, and there's a fairly high expectation of administration, and so scholarship wasn't necessarily the highest priority, so they brought in somebody to talk about that. And the first thing she did was talk about a study that had been done where faculty self-reported that they worked somewhere around 60 hours a week, and they felt that they were very overworked and that there just wasn't enough time to write. And so what she had them do is, for the 2-week or 3-week period, to write a map of when they worked and what they did during the hours in which they thought that they were working. And it turned out that instead of working about 60 hours a week, they were really working about 30 hours a week. In fact, nobody made it to what we would equate to a full-time position. They thought they were, but they weren't. And so that served it. So then I, of course, thought, I wonder if that's true for me. Because, of course, I perceive myself to work very hard. And so I did that, and it turns out I actually do work 60 hours a week, more or less. But what was interesting for me in doing that kind of experience was first identifying when and what kind of work I did where, which I already had a good idea of, but also it kind of made it into this game where it's like, okay, I've got to actually work another couple hours, because otherwise I won't have worked 8 hours today, even though, I spent an hour doing something that you can almost call work. And some of it is judgment calls, right? So it was kind of an interesting management tool, which I encourage you to do in order to sort of get a sense of where you are and where you spend your time and how you might be able to spend your time differently. And so that sort of is moving into one of my first points, which is very much the same as what I think you just heard, and that is setting up a schedule and setting up a set of rules for yourself. I work more like Mike than I do like Manfred. So as a graduate student, I took a job at a coffee shop from 5 to 7 every morning. I worked at the coffee shop from 7 to 10 or 7 to 11. I worked on my dissertation, and I did that every day. And then I came up to the school, because let's face it, once you come up here, nothing gets done, right? I mean, that's the time when you're answering emails, that's the time you go to the library, that's the time when you might be doing whatever kind of other work you do. And obviously, for me, once I come up to the school, any kind of meaningful scholarship is over for the day. So it's all about the administration of the department, is talking about my classes. So I transition through the day like that. And by the end of the day, I'm just sending out emails that take little to no brain power, right? And then a lot of that is also, I think, like my collecting information, trying to get things ready for the next morning when you can come back to look at it. So there's a sort of flow to the day. And I don't wait, and I can't wait for incremental or for big blocks of time, because those don't exist in my life. I have to work, and I do try to work very well incrementally. So think about those strategies, because sometimes it's just hard to get a block of time. And I'm not willing to commit a weekend day, a full weekend day to my scholarship, because I would prefer to go climbing or sailing or running or anything else, other things, because I also find having some semblance of a life outside of work to be a very valuable thing to integrate in. So setting some sort of schedule and figuring out what the rules are for yourself. So for example, I won't, or I very rarely answer work emails on the weekend. Oftentimes I won't even open that email unless I know that there's something going on that I need to be paying attention to. I might look at it, but I'll very rarely answer things until Monday morning. And that's because when I do work on the weekends, and it's always in the morning before I go off and do something else, it's about my scholarship as well. So always sort of finding the time to do that. Then again, much like everyone else, I impose deadlines on myself. I do that by submitting conference abstracts, making sure that there are papers that are in the pipeline. All of the conference papers that I present are going to be book chapters or articles. That's the first step in a process. Very, very rarely does anything just sort of end up on the sidelines. So think of that as a sort of process that you're using conferences for. The other thing, and again, most of this is like a game for me. If I submit for a conference, I will have a paper to present. I find it very bizarre that people go to conferences without having written their paper. I find that to be a waste of time, to be honest. And I don't understand why people do that. And yet it happens, you hear people doing it all the time. And I find, to be honest, I find panels where people haven't written papers and submitted them to the...
70% of academics don't get their work done.
It's
That's how it is.
Yeah, and you know, to me, it's sort of, if that deadline doesn't serve that purpose, clearly once the deadline's over, you're not gonna write the paper. And then I guess that means you just resubmit it to some other conference, and to me, that's gaming a system in a way that's not productive for me. I mean, I'd rather not go to a conference than go to a conference with nothing prepared. And to be honest, I find it kind of embarrassing when people are there not having been prepared. But that's just me. I'm possibly over-prepared all the time. So I use that to impose deadlines. This is a flaw for me. If people ask me to submit, to invite me to do a book chapter or invite me to be involved in a project, I say yes. I just say yes. And then I figure out how I'm going to manage it later. So the other part of that is trying to make sure that there's this whole sense, and I'm guessing both of you probably do very similar things, where you're always slightly overwhelmed by how much you have to do. You just kind of block that out because you can't think about it, and somehow it always gets done.
Sometimes it just takes 10 minutes of kind of
Yeah.
thinking something through, and then wham, it falls into place, you have
And
an
then-
outline.
yeah,
and then
exactly.
you don't feel overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed anymore. And sometimes when I'm feeling overwhelmed like this, and this gets back to what you were saying about coming up with that idea or bringing things together, I just go for a walk. Or the other thing, I'll just sit there on the couch and I'll stare at the ceiling. And then somehow things sort of start falling into place, and that gives you the next
It's the technology
step.
that helps, and that is now that I have a smartphone, if I have one of these epiphanies, I put a new memo file in, and then I email it to myself, and it ends up in the computer file.
Mhm.
So you gotta have something there, to
Mhm.
record it.
So it's just sort of some of these little tricks. The other thing I do is I have copious amounts of checklists that I'm writing everything down on, and it's very satisfying to cross them off. And then I try to break those down into smaller tasks, right? Because writing book doesn't really do much for you, right? That's going to be on your checklist for a really long time. So you have some of
Nobel
those.
Peace Prize.
Yeah, exactly. So, you can have those longer term goals, and I do, and those are written on a different checklist, but, there's the day-to-day checklist where it's like, okay, today I'm going to do this really, really teeny, small, discrete thing. But again, because of the way I work, a lot of stuff gets done incrementally. So I'm constantly sort of trying to build these incremental steps towards some sort of
I met a sports psychologist who operates in exactly the same way. If you're
Uh-huh.
playing tennis with somebody, he says, don't think that, I'm hoping to win this set.
Mhm.
You gotta concentrate on the very next moment that you
Mhm.
have to,
Mhm.
and hit the ball back, right?
Mhm.
Not, what's gonna happen after the rally, or,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. And if you really focus very specifically on what's next,
Right.
you can work. If you abstract it into something, the general goal, nothing happens.
And you get overwhelmed, and then,
Yeah.
yeah. And the same is true for my writing in the morning. If I've got 2 hours, it might not be that I get much further than a paragraph in that 2 hours, but that's a paragraph more than I had when I started. And I try to do it more in pages. So it's like, okay, I've added a couple extra pages today, but sometimes that doesn't work either. But it's, whatever kinds of games and challenges you can impose on yourself as a way of trying to move through it, I think that helps make it more possible. The only other thing I would add, two other things I would add. One is that I rarely have downtime, and that might not work for everybody, but if I'm going somewhere, I have a book with me. If I end up waiting for 10 minutes, I have 10 minutes to read. If I'm, sitting around somewhere, it's usually a book, right? I mean, a lot of reading happens then. But I don't think about downtime. I find it puzzling. When you sit on an airplane and there's these people just kind of staring at the front of their seat, it's like, how is it that you're gonna spend the next 10 hours of your life? Really? You're gonna stare at the seat? I mean, that just doesn't happen for me. There's always gotta be something happening. And of course, it's not always about work. There's lots of other things that I do. But still, not having downtime and always being prepared with something as a backup has gotten me through, I think, everything. And then finally, don't wait for perfection. I think that can be a flaw, and people are afraid to submit things either for conferences or for publication or for review because they want it to be perfect, and there's 10 other things they still have to read, and it's just not perfect yet. Just don't wait for that, because it's never going to come, and you're always going to be behind in your reading, and you're never going to be able to do it all. And so just make sure that at the point that it's as good as you can get it right, the argument needs to be seen by somebody else. And you've pushed all the weaknesses as far as you can take them. And you pretty much got a good sense that you've read the stuff that needs to be read, then you get it out. And that's what, I find peer review to be really valuable at that point, because it really helps you think through the things you couldn't think of on your own, but you have to be willing to let it go. And so you can't wait till it's perfect. So those are my tips for how I get everything done. And we'll see if I make it through this year, because I have a lot to do.
Perfect is the enemy of good.
Yes.
I had a few quick things that I was going to say, and then maybe just open things up as well. But I think one of the things that I found helpful is, and seeing other people do this sometimes, is things like conferences, things like peer groups, all these kinds of things. I think one way in which you can think about it is setting up commitments for yourself, and then making those commitments credible, right? Which is essentially like publicizing those commitments. So saying to your advisor, Professor, I'm going to come with you within a month, and I promise I'm going to have an outline of my dissertation. So you can you make these commitments to yourself, but you also make them so that they're sort of enforceable, right? It kind of depends on what kind of advisor you have. But it's the same thing, I think, with writing groups, right? If you have 3 or 4 people and you say, okay, let's meet once a week and let's just read what we've written this past week, right? You're creating a way in which you try and there's a kind of external pressure. And it's the same thing, I think, with conferences, right? Once you submit the conference and you're accepted, suddenly you have a deadline, and suddenly you have other people that are waiting on you and responsible for you. So all those kinds of things, I think, create external pressures if you're not the kind of person that can self-motivate all the time in a Zen-like way, that kind of thing. The only other thing I was going to say is that in graduate school and even now, a lot of my writing is rewriting. Just a massive amount. Maybe it's just me, but my initial writing oftentimes is very far from perfect, and so I'm kind of jotting down notes, structuring things. I'm actually still not good at only writing on the computer, so I'll print it out, fix it up, and I'll fix it on the computer, and I'll kind of do this iterative process a lot. I'd say more than half of, well over half of when I work on a paper is the process of rewriting, and we'll get to some stage, but then I'll print it out, rework it, print it out, rework it, and go through that process a lot. And so I think that's something that's really useful and important to kind of remember, that a lot of it is not just, it's the content, but it's also the writing and the structure and all those kinds of things. And that's really something that I think I tried to pick up in grad school as well.
It's hard to tell, actually, how your writing is working unless you reread it often. At the beginning of every day, I sort of start from the top and read through what I've done. So I frequently find that there are incoherences from one place to another. There's no topic sentence before the next paragraph begins, things like that. So.
Do you then start working? I find that if I do that, I never get further than paragraph number 4.
If I get antsy after about 10-15 minutes, and if I feel like I'm spending too much time at the top, I just go back to the bottom and start adding some stuff. Yeah, I don't want to totally kind of prevent myself from making more progress.
Right.
Yes, so some days I do the same thing, I rewrite, I mean, the whole process of writing is rewriting, and so the whole, you read down, but then at a certain point you say, okay, today I'm not reading down, I'm starting here. And then after a few weeks or whatever, you go back to the top because you haven't read it in a while, but yeah, you have to keep moving down that paper, and then you just start at section 1 and read from there.
Also, the concept of writing is important here. You know, one thing that is hard to do is to develop your own signature, your own style, as it were. And I just accepted an invitation to do something fairly brief, like 1,200 words on something, and part of the instruction said, we want you to include, you know, why you think this is really important in the thing. And I said back, you know, thanks for alerting me to this, but, you know, if this is what I have to do, you're not going to get anything from me, because whether something's important or not is what I have to, is what I hope is articulated by how I write. I'm not going to make explicative statements about, you know, what's going on in my writing. I hate that kind of style in a sense. You have to sort of develop a particular kind of writing integrity. It's really important.
Curious about Manfred's point about the journals. I feel like I'm stuck in this weird muddle there, because I've been trying to look and see what kind of journals people are talking about and what's important for me. But for every good journal, I find 10 horrible online journals written by who knows who. How do you distinguish, I guess? How do you know which journals are the good ones?
I think you kind of learn it by reading a lot of journals, which I've done all the time. And I have to say that, you know, I acquired that habit before the online era. So I would go to the stacks, actually. I would go to the library, and, you know, there were all these journals, and I would wander around. I wouldn't just stay in political science. You know, I would wander around and go to history, I'd go to sociology, I'd go to cultural, you know, stuff. So, you know, by doing that and by just picking up, you know, various issues of journals that looked really interesting, that's kind of how I got into it. And then, of course, over the years, you know, you get to know people, and you get to know, you know, certain kinds of journals that you really want to read. And, you know, sometimes, you know, you then get, you know, invited to serve on the editorial board down the road. But that's the kind of thing that happens, I think, in terms of actually reading a fair amount of journal articles. And if there's one thing that I've noticed is that, and I don't know how you feel about this, but a lot of graduate students don't seem to really read a lot of journal articles. It seems like, you know, there's books and things like that, but in terms of the actual stuff that's being produced right now, I don't think, you know, graduate students really get into that, and I find that, you know, problematic, really problematic, because in many ways, what Mike said at the beginning, you know, to be able to know, you know, who the people are that, you know, really turn you on, and you kind of interact with them in your own mind, and you get a sense of, you know, what people are saying with regard to certain questions that you have in your research. You've got to know your journal universe. And it's very hard to just do that on the basis of books. I don't think it can be done.
There's a search procedure that helps. Like the other day, I was interested in the way people think about the difference between boundaries on the one hand and frontiers on the other. And so I got into Google Scholar, right? A whole bunch of journal articles come up as a result of that. And I have a sense of what kind of journals work for me and what ones don't. Invariably, a communications journal is disappointing to me. It's kind of got a naive empiricism to it that I can't deal with. A literary journal works better for me, or a critical geography journal works better for me. And so I tend to skip the ones that I've already looked at that I realize operate in an idiom that's, you know, too far from how I think. So then I pick out the journal articles that make sense, begin to look at them, shape, you know, the conceptual part of what I'm working on as a result.
I think it also goes back to talking to faculty. And, you know, if you have your, you know, first advisor, and then you have other people on your committee or people that you interact with very often, you can ask them, and you can say, you know some of my writing, you know, you've taken classes, what do you think? You know, what are some of the journals that you would recommend? And you'd be surprised that, you know, that you get really good responses. And then you kind of look at those journals, and you start already, kind of a little bit like what you're saying, imagining, you know, in terms of a sense of where you belong. You write already with a certain kind of goal in terms of, you know, this is possibly 2 or 3 journals where this piece of writing, you know, this article could really go to. And I think that is really, really helpful. At least for me, it was very helpful.
I do a writing course sometimes for graduate students in which the main thing is for people to search journals and find a journal that seems to have the kind of article that the student aspires to, and then we try to do an analysis of that journal in the class. And how does one write for that journal?
Well, I think there's two things that go on. One is what journals are sort of canon or are kind of respected in a particular discipline, and then what journals are good for you, right? And those two don't necessarily overlap, but it's good to know, right? So it's like, oh, that was published in American Political Science Review, APSR, right? I mean, that may not be something that you read a lot, but you also know that it's supposed to be at least the flagship journal of the discipline of political science. That's really hard to get into, right? So I think knowing both of those is kind of helpful. And I think there's basic things. You want to make sure that it's peer reviewed, right, as a journal. You want to make sure that it's coming out of a respectable institution, to some degree. I think there's a lot more online journals now, but there's a whole universe and a spectrum. And so I think it was easier when things were published out on paper, because then you could actually go and see and get a sense of it. Nowadays it's a little bit harder because there's a lot of stuff that's online out there. And the other thing that my advisor had told me is sort of aim for the higher journals, and if you get rejected, work your way down. As long as you establish, so it's the combination of reputation and also fit, right? But that's kind of what I was told in terms of thinking about trying to get published.
A lot of it has to do with the crotchets of the kind of job you're headed toward. University of Wisconsin, now I was talking to someone in the education school, and she had to, for every journal that she had to publish an article, get a note from the editor in terms of what the rejection rate is.
Mm-hmm.
And that had to be in there.
Well, what's funny is Terrell, Carver, when he said rejection rates are really sort of random. I mean,
Yeah, but that's what the
Yeah, I know.
tenure promotion review committees want, even though it doesn't, it's bullshit nevertheless.
We should put together a journal, list of journals that our department finds valuable, that might be helpful for students.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think, even just sort of going along the perfect being the enemy of the good, even just sending something to a journal means that you have to actually go through the process of reading what they're about and going through all of their guidelines and making sure that it's at least some sort of coherent piece. Even that in itself is a really good process. Then, usually at minimum, you'll get a reply from the editor either saying, we don't think it's a good fit, or, oh, we'll send this out for review. And if they send it out for review, you may get rejected, but at least it always comes back with feedback. And my first article that I sent out, it was rejected outright the first time, but I did get, it was a Journal of Asian Studies, and I did get like really useful feedback based on that.
There's another thing about that is when you first get, a rejection, you just get angry, you look at that stuff, they're full of shit, they don't understand my stuff. But if you let it sit for a while, you begin to realize that actually some of the criticism is pretty good. But it's hard to see it as good at the beginning. It's give yourself, some space to look at it again a little bit later.
Could I maybe it's too much, but have maybe each of you just name a couple of journals that we ought to at least start with? Maybe mainstream and specific, that would be a good place to start.
Well, obviously, my answer would be Globalizations is one of the journals that I really like. I'm on the board there. And it's a transdisciplinary journal. It's very respected, and it's pretty, high up in the pecking order. And it's doing a lot of, as I said, transdisciplinary work, politics, sociology, cultural stuff, environment. So that's, certainly one that I look at. International Studies Quarterly I look at because, not necessarily because I think there's a lot of great stuff in there. It kind of varies, but it's just very, very respected, and what you often get is the kinds of articles that I'm interested in terms of social movement stuff. They've done, really kind of interesting articles, and it's not all the time that you get one, but I think from time to time. New Political Science is, I think, a really good one for grad students. I'm also on the board of New Political Science. That's the section of APSA, that's the left progressive section. and they have their own journal. Comes out with Taylor and Francis, really, really good publisher. And obviously it's refereed and everything. And they're doing a lot of really progressive stuff, from traditional Marxist to post-structuralist to more straightforward critical sociology type of thing. That's going to be all in there. And we have, I think there are a number of graduate students that I know, some of my graduate students, who've been able to get in there and get an article.
One thing to monitor about that is the editorial committees of these different journals change over time.
Yeah.
So sometimes a journal which was very traditional, like Security Dialogue, suddenly, when like Peter Burgess took over, became a critical journal. And so now it's a good place for critical IR work, as is the International Political Sociology Journal, say as compared with the ISQ and the International Studies Review, which is pretty mainstream kind of stuff. But one frame for all this is George Marcus, the anthropologist, said basically what academia is a series of textual communities. It's not just broad, kind of even within discipline. There are some people who read this particular kind of thinker, right, and they write for the same journals, they write for the same book series and that sort of thing. And so it's good to develop a cognitive map, basically, of the textual communities that are available and see where you fit. And that helps you select journals. Certain kinds of things you're not going to stick in a Straussian journal if you're a political theorist, unless you're a Straussian, right? Meaning dishonest. Making a radical distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric, and refusing to reveal how you really think.
Contemporary political theory is also, that's the one that Terrell Carver is now editing. That I much prefer to political theory because it's much more political. And talking to Terrell, I mean, Terrell served on both journals. While, there's good stuff in political theory too, I mean, it's probably still the #1 journal, although I think contemporary political theory is already getting close.
It's about to change the Jane Bennett just
Oh,
because.
that's I heard about that, so that's a good thing. But, contemporary political theory is one journal that I always looked, and read, and then obviously, the journal that you edited for
Theory and
theory and
Event
events.
for 5 years, it's a good place for critical work.
So I'll go on the website.
Mine are kind of the nexus of Asian politics, regional politics, and comparative politics. So, like on the official list of what's most reputable are things like Journal of Asian Studies, World Politics for comparative politics, things like there's a Journal of Comparative Politics, although some of that stuff is mixed.
Comparative political studies.
Comparative political studies, yeah, that's actually one I really like. It's much more historical, I think, in a lot of ways, a lot more qualitative work. And then there's some geography ones because of my work on territoriality and a lot of those go into. There was like an Asian geography journal that I ended up publishing, which was Asia Pacific Viewpoint. But there's also things like political geography. There's
Geopolitics.
Geopolitics, yeah, that's an excellent one.
Antipode.
What's that?
Antipode.
Yeah.
Millennium also kind of crosses. Millennium sometimes
Millennium.
critical geography, comparative, and IR.
That's right. I think Jared started now at a conference for Millennium.
Society and Space is also a good critical
Society and
geography.
Space, yeah. Environmental planning D?
Yeah, it's the same journal,
Yeah.
Society and Space Environmental.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things that so mine is sort of at the nexus of comparative Asia and a little bit of geography.
Some of the best journals for me are the literary journals, critical inquiry, representation.
Critical inquiry is really good, yeah. I like that too.
So we have Life Society, which of course John Hildebrand is currently editing, but not for much longer.
All culture and humanities.
Law, culture, and
Very
humanities.
broad.
Yeah, I think they'll be done this year, academic year. So it's good since the department has to go through our review of the journals in the library, we can sort of see these things.
There's also a new one that was started by graduate students in the UK, and it's called Journal of Critical Globalization Studies. And it's really, really good because it's actually run by very engaged UK PhD students.
And they do short pieces.
They do short pieces, and I think it really lends itself also to real contributions.
Yeah. Two of us in the department did something, and that was something.
Yeah, I had one in there too.
Yeah, four of us. Yeah.
I think one of the, given the state of the job market and, just in terms of thinking about professionalization, one of the ways that you can really distinguish yourself when you go on the job market is to actually have a peer-reviewed article either submitted, but at some places it's sort of like you need to have one or two even to get your graduate department to support you on the job market. I don't think that's necessarily how it is here. But, if you get a good letter of recommendation, a lot of people get good letters of recommendation, right? We have, I think, a lot of teaching experience, but some other places have a lot of teaching experience as well. But, in terms of publishing, I think that's oftentimes where you can really distinguish yourself and make yourself at least seem as if you are, you have a potential, because that's really what they're judging when you're applying to these kinds of positions. And when you show that you've gone through this process, not just the substance of what you've done, but that you know what the profession is about, I think that says a lot.
That can be set up, sometimes when I go to a seminar, or contacted a journal and said, I want to do a monograph issue, I'm doing a course on this, and then you get 5 or 6 student papers, as well as one of mine, and you get published in that journal. Done it twice with the Journal for Cultural Research, for example.
I just want to add also Journal of Political Ideologies, because that's another one that I know some graduate students have success with. It's also pretty transdisciplinary. Journal of Political Ideologies, yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts or interventions or comments?
I'd be interested in hearing what your biggest obstacle is in terms of getting stuff done. If you had to say one thing that is really, you've been struggling with, it'd be interesting, I guess, for us to hear what that would be. I mean, obviously it can't all be reduced to one, but what's the first thing that you've been struggling with that makes it fun? Yeah.
Focusing on something, because while I'm trying to get something done and I have to narrow it down, I always end up, while I'm reading, I see something and I start reading about it. And then I see something in the other article and I start reading about it. So it's like a chain reaction, and it really gives me a hard time, because then it gets really harder and harder to focus on what I'm actually doing. And I'm a distracted person in that sense, because whenever I see something, just like a dog, I just turn to that direction, and then I see something and turn to that direction, and I'm really having a hard time to, get rid of this. Because although it's really good in a way that it broadens your point of view, and you just realize something, for example, you haven't been thinking of, but it's, on the other hand, it's postponing your work. And if you have a deadline, like you said, it's not good. So.
Well, exactly the same thing happens to me all the time, I read the footnote and I follow that, and I read something else in that one, I follow that. But you just have to commit yourself to actually writing a paragraph or two nevertheless. That's what breaks that, kind of.
I find myself in the same situation, and I'm finding that I have a very good advisor right now. So we sit down, it's just once a month, but she says, okay, next month, you have to have it's not like a big thing, you have to have your research question more honed down. So that, if I take these tangents, it's kind of like, I think what Mike says about filling up your head. I feel like I agree that, there's so much to fill my head up with, but at the same time, I have to come back to, okay, what is my research? That's the biggest thing. What is my research question? To get started on that process.
And partly it just depends on timing. I mean, you're in your first semester, right?
Yeah.
So to some extent, I think there's a great benefit to reading broadly and getting a lot of ideas, especially the first year or two, you know, when you're doing the coursework. And the whole point of, at least when I'm teaching that course, is sort of like trying to get a broad view of different kinds of perspectives in classic works and all that kind of thing. But it's true, like once you finish your, at least oftentimes you read from it, once you finish your comps and your proposal, zoom. I mean, you're supposed to really sort of narrow it towards that particular topic. So it's kind of like, it's a delicate trade-off, but it's not necessarily a bad thing either, right?
Yeah, I would add to that as well and say for the first or second semester, I think it's perfectly fine. I don't see a real problem with that. I think when it becomes a habit that goes beyond that, that might be problematic. But you know, as Mike said, you know, you keep writing, but I don't think you should worry too much about the fact that you're doing that now, because I think that's the phase where it makes a lot of sense.
So it's normal, I believe.
And it's fun. I mean, part of what's fun about this is the way in which you get someplace you didn't expect to go because you're reading all this great thing. I mean, so I don't understand why people don't take classes that are completely unrelated to what they want to do.
I always did that too.
Because it's so interesting to
Yeah.
get at this, wow, I kind of think that might be interesting. And so it's just
Yeah, I
part of the
remember-
process of being a scholar.
I did that the first 2 years, but now that I'm in my third
Right,
year,
and then,
I have
then
to
you
start-
focus in, exactly, and then you start
do my
focusing.
comps and all that by the end
Yeah.
of it.
But, you know, the other point I think is that when we talk about like what is original contributions that you're supposed to make, a lot of that time, you know, a lot of that isn't like something that comes out of nowhere, right? It's all often articulations of knowledge. So it's like, it's something that's in this particular discipline, but it's also something that's something outside of it, and it's the way in which they come together. And so then you have to read broadly to some extent too.
That's become my curse in working on this. I'm always convinced somebody else has already made this argument, or that there's some hugely important work that I missed, and when I write something, somebody's going to point it out. And so I better read everything ever written before I start writing.
Yeah, no.
That's
Right.
another thing, learning how to read and get something out of something, you have to learn to do it efficiently. So eventually you should be able to pick up a 300-page book and within a half an hour, 40 minutes, discover in it what you have to read and what you can ignore. And that requires you to read that kind of thing quite a little, so you can say, oh, here's more of this, more of this, oh, here's something, and here's more of this and more of this.
And also, I think it helps to say that yes, everything you can think of has been written about. The answer is yes. And there's always something more to read. The answer is yes, which goes back to the perfection point.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you know, there is a new wrinkle. You know, even if you, I mean, think of biographies, for example. I mean, we have biographies of people, you know, 10, 12, 15 biographies, and you know, it's pretty much clear that you know this person's been well researched, and yet each biography has a different angle, has a different take, has a different perspective, or emphasizes things, or wants to do something, and it's a creative process. So in that sense, you know, fine, you know, you just take it for granted that everything has been written about, and there's always more to read, but you still can have your own little, you know, perspective. You bring something to it that I think is original in terms of a fresh pair of eyes that's going to look at that and make sense of it.
And a you know, kind of conceptualization, like there are many biographies of William James over the years, and then someone wrote one called Becoming William James. In which basically, okay, it's not a matter if you have this full, you know, creative personality who then writes something. You know, how did this person develop and become what he became? And that provided an interesting angle. And it also drew on this called philosophical traditions which deal with the distinction between being and becoming. So you know, you have some conceptual power there to bring to the biography.
I think that's right. So sometimes like it's the new biography where it's like they found some stash of archives that no one had seen before,
Right.
so there's
That's
new
possible.
data there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's like, you know, Doris Kern Goodwin who like said, oh, I want to look at Lincoln compared to some of the other rivals that he had during that time, right? So they framed it differently. She didn't really find any secret stash. I mean, there's nothing left to uncover about Lincoln, right? So there's different, I think it's useful to think about what your value added is and how you're articulating. Anyone else want to say something about
I do have a meeting, but I don't know why I did that.
Actually, we are around noon.
I have a really basic question. You may have already covered it. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the whole thing. in terms of publishing for peer review, is that something, I'm a master's student, is that something that master's students generally strive to do? And if so, I'm not really sure about like where to begin. Do I just approach a
There's always
professor?
no
and-
time like the present, you know,
Right.
begin as soon as you can.
Yeah,
Reminds me of a really funny remark Neil Milner made. There was a guy who jumped out a window and killed himself, and in the obituary, we noticed that he published his first 2 books while he was an undergraduate. And Neil said, "I would have done that too if I didn't have to spend so much time at the dermatologist."
Well, I think for a master's student, it's definitely something you want to do, because regardless whether you're going to go on for a PhD program or you take a job, I think it's always good to have some sort of published work.
right.
And, you know, we were talking about knowing your journals, getting to know your journals, and find out what are the journals that interest you and, or that raise similar questions to the questions that you're interested in. Who are the people? I think that's really helpful.
Okay, and then with the calls for papers, do people tend to write papers for specific conferences, or?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
And don't get discouraged. You know, William Gibson, who has Sentences to Die For in all his great books, you know, he didn't score in his first 5 or 6 manuscript submissions. You know.
okay, thank you.
Expect failure, a lot of it, because of the territory.
Revel in it.
Yeah.
I think
Oh, I guess you
Ulysses
don't.
was rejected 37 times, I think.
All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. So Mike, are you, Mike, are you taking the writing